The wind had a name out here, and it was malice. It was a living thing, born in the furnace of the sun-scorched plains to the west, and it died 1,000 miles later in the teeth of the mountains. But its life's work was to torment the patch of ochre dirt and vermilion rock that Silas Blackwood called home. It never stopped. It scoured the land with a sandpaper breath, peeling paint from his small clapboard house, stealing the moisture from the soil, and whispering lies of failure into the ears of his cattle. This was a land that gave nothing for free. It was a hard, unforgiving country of skeletal yucca, stubborn creosote, and horizons that shimmered with heat and broken promises. Life clung by a thread, and death was a patient neighbor, always watching from the shade of a lonely butte, waiting for a moment of weakness. For 2 years, Silas had lived in a state of quiet truce with the land and his grief. The silence in his house was as vast and profound as the star-dusted sky outside. It was a silence carved out by fire, the memory of flames licking at the night, stealing his Sarah and leaving behind nothing but the scent of ash and a scorch mark on his soul that would never fade. He was a man whittled down to his essentials: work, solitude, and the dull ache of memory. He was not old, just past 30, but the sun and sorrow had etched lines around his eyes that spoke of a much longer, harder road. His hands were calloused and capable, his shoulders broad from a life of labor, but his gaze often drifted, lost somewhere in the haze of what used to be. Loneliness, he'd discovered, was a different kind of predator than a wolf or a cougar. It didn't tear at the flesh but gnawed at the spirit. A slow, methodical erosion. It was this gnawing that had led him, in a moment of desperate clarity, to write the letter. He'd seen the advertisement in a dog-eared copy of a Chicago newspaper, tucked between notices for patent medicines and barbed wire. Pious, hard-working women of good character seek God-fearing husbands in the West. It had felt like a surrender, a betrayal of Sarah's memory. But the silence had answered his doubts with its own hollow echo. So he wrote, his blunt words feeling clumsy and false on the page, describing his ranch, his prospects, his need for a companion to share the burden of this life. He sent it to a name, a P.O. box address, Eliza Mayhew. He expected nothing. The mail rider came once a fortnight, and for 3 months. Silas met him with a stoic nod and returned to his work with an empty mailbag and a heavier heart. He'd almost forgotten, almost resigned himself to the wind being his only companion, when the letter arrived. It was thin, the envelope a startling white against his dusty palm. Her script was delicate, a series of careful loops and precise lines that seemed as out of place here as a wildflower in a branding pit. The letter was brief, proper. She thanked him for his correspondence. She was of good health, raised in a Methodist orphanage in Ohio, and proficient in all domestic duties. She understood the hardships of frontier life and was prepared to meet them with fortitude and a prayerful heart. She accepted his proposal of marriage. She would arrive on the afternoon train, the 5th of October. Today was the 5th of October. The letter, now folded and worn soft in his shirt pocket, felt like a live coal against his chest. It had stirred something in him, a feeling he couldn't name, a mix of hope and sheer, gut-twisting terror. A stranger was coming, a woman who would sleep in his house, eat at his table, and wear the title that had belonged only to Sarah. The thought sent him into a frenzy of preparation, a desperate attempt to scrub the past from the present. He started with the barn, mending a loose stall door and spreading fresh hay until the air smelled sweet and clean. He checked the fences of the corral. His hammer blows a frantic rhythm against the silence. But the house was the true challenge. It was a ghost, Sarah's ghost. Her presence lingered in the faded calico curtains she'd sewn, in the small rocking chair by the cold hearth, in the very grain of the wooden floorboards. He opened all the windows, letting the malicious wind tear through the rooms, as if it could scour away the memories along with the dust. He swept and scrubbed, his movements rough and angry. He came to the bedroom, to the wall behind where the headboard of their bed used to be, a dark, ugly stain marred the wood, a shadow of the fire that had started when a lantern overturned. He had rebuilt the wall, but he'd never been able to sand away the blackness. It was a part of the house now, a part of him. He ran his hand over the scorched wood, the rough surface a familiar penance. He had been in the barn, tending to a sick calf. When it happened, he had heard the scream, a sound that had torn the fabric of the night and his life. He had run, but he was too late. He pushed the heavy oak bed he'd built against the opposite wall, away from the stain. It was a futile gesture, but it was all he could do. He laid out fresh linens, the stark white a painful contrast to the room's gloom. This would be her room, for now. The thought of sharing a bed with another woman, in this house, was an impossibility, a sacrilege he wasn't ready to contemplate. He hitched the buckboard and drove the 5 miles into the town of Redemption. It wasn't much of a town, more a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, clinging to the railroad tracks as its lifeline. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pointing an accusatory finger at the indifferent blue sky. He tied the horses in front of the station just as the distant wail of the train whistle drifted on the wind. A knot tightened in his stomach. The townsfolk who were out and about watched him with undisguised curiosity. Silas Blackwood kept to himself. His rare trips to town were for supplies, conducted with grim efficiency. His presence at the train station, waiting, was an event. Old Man Hemlock, the store owner, leaned in his doorway, stroking his tobacco-stained beard. A few cowboys, loitering outside the saloon, paused their conversation to stare. Silas felt their eyes on his back, hot and probing. He ignored them, focusing on the black smoke pluming on the horizon. The train, a great, smoke-belching iron beast, screamed into the station, hissing steam and grinding to a halt. A few passengers disembarked, a drummer with a suitcase full of wares, a family heading further west, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety. And then, her. She stepped down from the passenger car, and for a moment, Silas thought he had made a terrible mistake. She was dressed in a simple, high-collared wedding gown of white cotton. It was not fancy, devoid of lace or frills, but on the dusty platform of Redemption, it was as conspicuous as a snowdrift in July. She carried a single, small carpet bag. Her posture was erect, her movements graceful and contained. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, was pale and composed. She was pretty, in a quiet, fragile way, like a porcelain doll. She looked exactly as a mail-order bride from a Methodist orphanage should look. But then she lifted her head and her eyes met his, and Silas's breath caught in his throat. There was nothing fragile in her eyes. They were a deep, startling gray, the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths, behind the veneer of demure propriety, was a flicker of something else. Not fear, not hope. It was something older, harder, a knowingness that didn't belong in the face of a sheltered orphan. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by a look of mild inquiry as she identified him from his description in the letters. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice was soft, low-pitched, with none of the Midwestern twang he'd expected. "Ma'am," he managed, his own voice sounding like gravel. He tipped his hat, feeling clumsy and oversized in her serene presence. He took her bag, surprised by its lightness. The whispers of the townspeople followed them like flies. "That's her? A mail-order bride. Looks like a church mouse, don't she?" Silas Blackwood, of all people, thought he'd grieve for Sarah Till the day he died. He felt a flush of anger creep up his neck. He wanted to shield her from it, to hurry her away to the isolation of the ranch where the only judgments came from the land and the sky. He helped her onto the buckboard, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was cool, smooth. He climbed up beside her and snapped the reins, urging the horses into a brisk trot out of town. For the first mile, They rode in silence. The rattling of the wagon and the plodding of the horse's hooves were the only sounds. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of dark hair from her bun and lashing it across her cheek. She didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the brutal, beautiful landscape unfolding before them. Silas expected questions about the ranch, the cattle, the work that lay ahead. He had his answers prepared, practical and direct. Her first question caught him completely off guard. "Do you believe in damnation, Mr. Blackwood?" He turned to look at her. Her face was impassive, her eyes still on the distant mountains. The question hung in the air between them, bizarre and unsettling. "I believe a man reaps what he sows," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "And what of a woman? Is her harvest the same? The Lord doesn't distinguish by gender when it comes to sin. I reckon—" A faint, wry smile touched her lips for a fleeting moment. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes. The Lord may not, but men do. Silas didn't know how to respond. This was not the conversation he had imagined. He had expected talk of recipes and church socials, not of sin and damnation. He felt a growing unease, a sense that the woman beside him was a far more complex creature than her simple white dress and pious letters suggested. They lapsed back into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was charged, filled with the weight of her strange words. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it was fierce, almost painful to watch. "A wedding dress is a peculiar garment," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear over the wind. "It's meant to signify purity, a clean slate." She smoothed a fold of the white cotton on her lap. "But a slate can be wiped clean many times. Does that make it pure, or merely empty?" I don't know, ma'am," Silas stammered, feeling like he was being tested in a way he did not understand. "Please," she said, turning her gaze on him for the first time since leaving town. The full force of her stormy gray eyes was unnerving. "Call me Eliza. We are to be man and wife." "Eliza," he repeated. The name felt foreign on his tongue. "Tell me, Silas," she continued, her use of his first name both intimate and jarring. "When you wrote for a wife, what was it you truly craved? A housekeeper? A cook? Or was it the warmth of another body beside you in the dark, a shield against the loneliness?" His hands tightened on the reins. Her questions were too sharp, too close to the bone. They stripped away the practical pretenses and laid bare the raw, aching need that had driven him to write that first letter. It felt indecent, like she had reached inside his chest and touched the very core of his solitude. "A man needs a helpmate," he said, his voice tight. It was the truth, but it felt like a lie, a pitifully small fraction of the whole truth. "A helpmate," she echoed, and the way she said it made the word sound hollow, clinical. "Of course." She asked no more questions. They completed the journey back to the ranch as the last light bled from the sky and the first stars pricked the deepening velvet of the night. The small house looked even smaller and more isolated in the twilight. He helped her down from the wagon, and she stood for a moment, looking at the dark windows, her expression unreadable. Inside, he lit a lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space feel alive and threatening. He had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread. They ate in near silence at the small wooden table. He found he had no appetite. He was acutely aware of her every movement, the delicate way she held her fork, the quiet grace of her posture. She ate methodically, without any sign of pleasure or distaste. When the meal was finished, he gestured towards the closed door of the bedroom. "That will be your room," he said. "I'll take the cot in the main room here." She simply nodded, her eyes briefly flicking towards the scorched wall he had tried to hide with the bed, though from this angle she couldn't have known what was there. "Thank you for your consideration, Mr. Blackwood," "Silas." "It's late," he said gruffly. "It's been a long day of travel for you." She rose from the table. "Good night." She went into the bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. Silas was left alone in the main room with the flickering lantern and the howling of the wind outside. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if a foreign element had been introduced into his carefully ordered world, an element whose properties he could not begin to fathom. He unrolled his cot on the far side of the room, near the hearth. He blew out the lantern, plunging the house into a darkness broken only by the thin moonlight filtering through the windows. The house was no longer silent. He could hear the faint rustle of her movements from the other room, the soft creak of the bed springs as she lay down. He lay on his back, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, his mind racing. Who was this woman? This Eliza Mayhew with the demure dress and the old, knowing eyes, this mail-order bride who spoke of damnation and desire as easily as another might speak of the weather? A sound drifted from her room, so faint he almost missed it. It was the sound of her voice, a soft, rhythmic whisper. He strained to listen, thinking she might be ill or in distress. He realized she was praying. The words were indistinct, a gentle, pious murmur that went on and on. It should have been reassuring, a confirmation of the woman he thought he was marrying. But it wasn't. He lay there, feigning sleep, every muscle tense. The whispering stopped. The house fell quiet again. Save for the wind, he thought she must have fallen asleep. But then, in a sliver of moonlight that cut across the floor, he saw a sliver of darkness under her door. The door had creaked open, just a fraction of an inch, and through that crack, he felt it more than saw it, the intense, unwavering weight of her gaze. She was not praying anymore. She was not sleeping. In the deep, impenetrable darkness of their first night under the same roof, in a house haunted by one woman's memory and thrown into turmoil by another's arrival, Eliza was watching him, and Silas Blackwood, for the first time since the fire, felt a fear that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with the living. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the desert sun. Eliza was a tireless worker, a silent phantom of efficiency who moved through the small house and the dusty ranch yard with a purpose that bordered on grim. She rose before Silas, the smell of coffee and frying bacon already hanging in the air when he came in from the first milking. The house, which had long felt like a hollowed-out shell, began to feel like a home again, but a stranger's home. It was cleaner than it had been in years, organized with a precision that was almost unnerving. His shirts were mended, his meals were punctual, and a quiet order descended upon the chaos of his bachelor existence. She was the perfect helpmate he had written for, and yet she was a ghost at his side. A chasm of silence and space separated them, a boundary of her own making that was as real and impassable as a barbed wire fence. She never initiated conversation beyond the necessities of the day. "The well is running a little low," or "We'll need more flour on your next trip to town." When he spoke to her, she would listen with a polite, still attentiveness, her gray eyes fixed on his. But her answers were always brief, contained, offering no purchase for a deeper discussion. More profound than the silence was her meticulous avoidance of all physical contact. If they passed in the narrow hallway, she would flatten herself against the wall, her hands clasped, until he was by. If he handed her a tool in the barn, her fingers would pluck it from his with the quick, deft motion of a bird snatching a seed, careful not to brush against his skin. They worked side by side for hours, mending a stretch of fence under the blistering sun. Yet she maintained a precise, inviolable distance between them. At first, Silas attributed it to a maidenly shyness, the natural reserve of a pious woman thrust into a new life with a strange man. He respected it. He made a point of giving her space, of moving slowly, of announcing his presence before entering a room. He was a patient man, accustomed to the slow, stubborn pace of the land. He could be patient with a wife. But as the weeks bled into one another, he began to see it was more than shyness. It was a deep, ingrained aversion, a flinching away from the world that was as instinctual as a horse shying from a snake. He saw it one evening when a bat swooped low over the porch where they sat in the cooling air. He had instinctively reached out to steady her, his hand landing on her shoulder. She froze under his touch, not with a gasp of surprise, but with a sudden, deathly stillness. Her entire body went rigid, a statue carved from fear. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. She said nothing, but he saw the tremor in her hands for a full minute afterward. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Silas found himself drawn to her. He was a simple man, and his grief for Sarah had been a simple, straightforward thing, a clean, sharp pain. Eliza was a puzzle, a book written in a language he didn't understand. He would watch her when she thought he wasn't looking. He watched the way she kneaded dough, her hands strong and sure, a stark contrast to her delicate frame. He watched the way she looked out at the horizon at dusk, her face set in a mask of such profound melancholy that it made his own loneliness ache in sympathy. She was a creature of profound contradictions, her dutiful, almost subservient manner, and the fierce, unyielding intelligence that burned in her eyes. There were moments, fleeting and accidental, that breached her defenses. Once, reaching for the same bucket handle, their hands brushed. It was the briefest of contacts, but he felt a jolt, a surprising warmth from her skin. She pulled her hand back instantly, a faint blush rising on her cheeks, the first sign of color he had ever seen there. He found himself thinking about that touch for the rest of the day, the memory of it a small, warm ember in the cold grate of his life. These accidental touches became charged events, tiny sparks in the dry tinder of their existence. Each one left him feeling strangely unsettled, a mix of guilt and a longing for more. The mystery of his wife deepened one sweltering afternoon. He was returning from the far pasture, his clothes soaked with sweat, his throat raw with dust. He came to the house, anticipating the cool water from the basin just inside the door. He pushed the door open without thinking. It was a mistake. Eliza was standing in the main room, her back to him. She was in her chemise, having clearly been washing herself to escape the oppressive heat. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating her in a stark bar of light, and on the pale skin of her back, he saw them. They were not the angry, puckered scars of a fresh wound, but faint, silvery lines, almost invisible in a different light. They looked like old burns, a delicate tracery of healed-over pain that ran from her left shoulder blade down towards her waist. They were marks of a history she had never spoken of, a story of violence that stood in horrific contrast to her quiet, gentle presence. They were obscene on her delicate skin, a desecration. She must have felt his presence, or the sudden chill of the open door. She spun around, clutching the front of her chemise, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered animal panic he had never seen before. For a moment, she looked utterly broken, her careful composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. He saw not just fear in her eyes, but a deep, profound shame. Silas was rooted to the spot, his own thirst forgotten. He felt like a clumsy intruder who had stumbled upon a sacred, secret sorrow. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough. "You're back." He expected tears, a denial, an explanation. He received none of them. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the mask of composure slipped back into place, though the terror still lingered in the depths of her eyes. She even managed a small, sad smile that was more painful to look at than any tears. "Sometimes," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the thick, hot air. "Sometimes even angels get burned." She turned away from him then, grabbing her dress and retreating into the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. Silas was left standing in the doorway. The image of those silvery scars burned into his mind. Sometimes even angels get burned. The words echoed in his head, cryptic and chilling. What kind of fire had she walked through? What kind of hell had left its ghostly map on her skin? His unease coalesced into a certainty. The pious, simple orphan from Ohio was a fiction, a carefully constructed role she was playing. The real woman, the one with the scars and the storm in her eyes, was a complete stranger to him. The incident changed nothing and everything, on the surface. Their routine continued as before, but the air between them was now thick with the unspoken question. Silas found he couldn't look at her without seeing the scars, without wondering about the pain that had created them. His attraction to her became tangled with a new, protective instinct and a dark, consuming curiosity. A few days later, a tension in the house had become so thick it was almost suffocating. Silas, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, decided they needed to escape it. "The cattle in the North Valley need checking," he announced at breakfast, not looking at her. "The ride is a good one. You should come. The air will do you good." He expected her to refuse, to offer an excuse about chores. To his surprise, she simply looked at him for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, and said, "Very well." He saddled his steady gelding, Marengo, and a gentler mare for her. She came out of the house wearing not her usual drab work dress, but the simple white wedding gown, which she had apparently altered for riding. The sight of it was a jolt. She handled the horse with an easy, confident grace that surprised him. They rode out from the ranch, leaving the oppressive silence of the house behind them. The land here was different. The trail climbed out of the dusty basin onto a high mesa that overlooked a vast, sweeping valley. The wind was cleaner up here, carrying the scent of sage and pine. They rode in their customary silence for a while, but it was a more companionable silence, dwarfed by the grandeur of the landscape around them. They stopped at the ridge of the valley. The view was breathtaking. The world fell away beneath them in a tapestry of red rock, green juniper, and the shimmering gold of dry grass. The sun was beginning to set, and long, dramatic shadows stretched across the valley floor. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time he had ever heard a note of genuine awe in her voice. "My father brought me here when I was a boy," Silas said, finding his own voice. "He said, 'This is where you can see the hand of God.'" Eliza turned to look at him, a strange, intense expression on her face. "Or perhaps," she said softly, "this is where you can see just how small and insignificant all our little sins are." She dismounted and walked to the very edge of the cliff, her white dress a stark beacon against the darkening red rock. He watched her, a knot of apprehension in his gut. He dismounted and went to stand a few feet behind her. The wind whipped her hair and pressed the thin cotton of her dress against her body, outlining her slender form. "They say a marriage should be built on truth. Silas," she said, without turning around. Her voice was carried back to him on the wind, a low, intimate murmur. "I believe that," he said. She finally turned to face him. The setting sun lit her face, turning her gray eyes to molten silver. "Do you, or do you believe in the comfort of a well-told story? The kind a woman tells a man because she knows it's the story he wants to hear?" "I don't understand," he said, though a cold part of him was beginning to. She took a step closer to him, closing the space he had so carefully tried to maintain. She was so close now he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She reached up, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought she was going to touch his face. Instead, her fingers lightly traced the collar of his shirt. "You are a good man, Silas Blackwood," she whispered, her gaze holding his. "You believe in hard work and honesty and a God who keeps neat, orderly books of right and wrong." She leaned closer still, her lips almost brushing his ear. Her breath was warm, smelling faintly of the wild mint she sometimes chewed. "But there are other books, messier ones where the angels and the demons get their pages mixed up. Have you ever wanted to read from one of those books?" His heart was hammering against his ribs. Her words were a seduction, but not of the body. It was a seduction of the soul, a temptation to look into the abyss she so clearly knew. He was both terrified and utterly captivated. He could only stare at her, speechless. They rode back in the deepening twilight, the spell of the ridge still clinging to them. The tension was back, but it had transformed. It was no longer a cold, empty space, but a taut wire humming with a dangerous energy. That night, the wind rose to a gale, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves of the house like a restless spirit. The temperature dropped. Silas lay on his cot, unable to sleep, listening to the storm and the silence from the other room. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. He got up, lit the lantern, and knocked softly on her door. Eliza. The door opened. She was standing there in her nightgown, her long dark hair unbraided and falling around her shoulders. She looked younger, more vulnerable. "The wind's found a crack in the wall by my cot," he lied, his voice sounding unnatural to his own ears. It's cold. The main bed is warmer. You should take it." He had meant to offer her the bed for herself. He had meant to be a gentleman. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the flickering lamplight. She seemed to understand the lie and the truth beneath it. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We would both be warmer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And so it was decided. He followed her back into the room, his mouth dry. He blew out the lantern. In the darkness, he heard her slip under the covers. After a long hesitation, he went to the other side of the bed and lay down on top of the quilt, his boots still on. The bed, which had once seemed so large and empty, now felt impossibly small. He was acutely aware of her lying just a few feet away. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing. He could feel the heat of her body across the small gulf of mattress that separated them. The air was thick, charged with unspoken desire and a terrible, paralyzing uncertainty. He lay as still as stone, every muscle clenched, fighting a war within himself. The part of him that was a lonely, grieving man ached to reach for her, to feel the simple comfort of another human being in the dark. But the other part, the part that respected her fear and sensed her fragility, held him back. He didn't know how long they lay there like that. Two separate islands of tension in the same bed. An hour, an eternity. Then, he felt a movement. Slowly, hesitantly, he felt her hand touch his arm, her fingers light as a moth's wing on his coarse shirt sleeve. The touch sent a shockwave through him. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hand slid from his arm to his chest, then up to his neck, her cool fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He turned his head on the pillow. In the faint moonlight, he could just make out the pale oval of her face, her eyes wide and dark. She leaned towards him, her hair brushing against his cheek, and then her lips touched his. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a kiss of infinite sadness, of desperate, questioning need. It was soft, hesitant, and tasted of salt, though he didn't know if the tears were hers or his. He responded instinctively, his own desperate loneliness rising to meet hers, for a single, breathless moment. The chasm between them was closed. He felt a sense of homecoming so profound it made him dizzy. And then, just as quickly, she pulled away. A ragged, choked sob tore from her throat. She scrambled back to her side of the bed, curling into a tight ball, her face buried in the pillow. Her shoulders shook with violent, silent crying. Silas lay frozen, the ghost of her kiss still on his lips. He reached a hand out, wanting to comfort her, but stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. What comfort could he offer to a pain he didn't understand? He had crossed a line, and so had she, and it had led them here, to this place of tears and confusion. He listened to her cry herself into an exhausted silence. He lay awake for the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one raging inside him. The questions hammered at him. relentless and unanswerable. Who was this woman who offered a glimpse of heaven and then plunged them both into hell? Who was this angel with the burned back and the tears of a fallen soul? Who was Eliza? The cold dawn that broke after their fractured night was a merciless thing. It offered no softness, no gentle transition from dark to light, but simply ripped the night away, exposing the landscape in a harsh, gray clarity. Inside the house, a new silence had fallen, heavier and colder than any that had come before. The previous silence had been one of unfamiliarity, of caution. This new silence was a monument to a ruin. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting is done, thick with the ghosts of what might have been. They moved around each other like strangers who had suffered a shared, unspeakable embarrassment. At breakfast, their hands fumbled for the coffee pot, their eyes fixed on the table, the floor, the window, anywhere but on each other. When Silas spoke, his voice was a low rasp, stripped of all warmth. More rain coming. I think sky has the look of it. Yes, Eliza replied, her own voice a thread of sound. The air is heavy. They were talking about the weather, but the words were about themselves. The air in the small room was heavy enough to crush a man's ribs. The kiss, the tears, the long, frigid hours spent lying side by side in the dark. It all lay between them on the table, a feast of regret for Silas. The memory of her lips was a brand, a confusing mixture of tenderness and deep, inexplicable sorrow. He had tasted her desperation, and it had frightened him more than any outlaw's gun. For her, he could not guess. Her face was a pale, locked mask, her eyes shadowed and distant. The wall she kept around herself was no longer just a fence. It was a fortress, rebuilt overnight with stone and ice. The day wore on in this state of suspended misery. Silas worked with a furious, punishing energy, attacking his chores as if they were a physical enemy. He rehanged a gate, his hammer blows echoing the frantic pounding in his own chest. He roped a steer that needed tending with a vicious snap of his wrist. He was trying to sweat the memory of the night out of his pores, to exhaust the confusion from his mind. But her image was persistent, her hair loose in the moonlight, her eyes dark with a sorrow he couldn't name, the ragged sound of her sobs. It was mid-afternoon when he saw the rider. He was just a speck at first, a shimmer of movement on the far edge of the plain, slowly resolving out of the heat haze. Visitors were rare. A neighbor might ride over once a season. The mail rider came and went with brisk efficiency. But a lone stranger heading directly for the ranch was an anomaly. And in this land, anomalies were rarely good news. Silas stopped his work, leaning on his shovel. His eyes narrowed against the sun's glare. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck. The man rode a tired-looking roan, and as he drew closer, Silas could see he was as weary and dust-caked as his mount. He was a thin, wiry man with a face that looked like it had been slapped together from spare parts. A long, crooked nose, a weak chin covered in several days of greasy stubble, and small, restless eyes that darted about, taking in everything. He wore a dusty bowler hat and a threadbare coat. Despite the heat, he looked like a man who was either running from something or chasing something he was never meant to catch. Eliza had come to the porch of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Silas saw the way she froze, her hand held halfway to the wash basin, her body suddenly as taut as a wire. The stranger reined his horse in a few yards from where Silas stood. His shifty eyes flicked from Silas to the house, and when they landed on Eliza, a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Well, I'll be," the man drawled, his voice slick with a false familiarity. "Found you at last. It's a long way from the bright lights to a dust hole like this, ain't it?" Silas straightened up, his hand tightening on the shovel handle. "State your business," he said, his voice low and hard. The man ignored him. His gaze was fixed on Eliza, who had not moved. She looked like a trapped bird, her face drained of all color. cat got your tongue, Marietta, the stranger said, the smile widening. You ain't forgot old Cole Hackett, have you? We had some times, you and me, you poured a mean whiskey. Marietta. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. It was not her name. It was a name that belonged to this greasy stranger, to a life of bright lights and pouring whiskey. He looked at Eliza, at his wife, and saw the raw, unadulterated panic in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had when he'd seen the scars on her back, magnified 100 times. You are mistaken, Eliza said, and her voice, though it trembled, was laced with ice. My name is Eliza. You have the wrong person. Please leave this property. Cole Hackett laughed, a short, ugly bark. Eliza, is it now? Got yourself a new name to go with the new dress. Always were good at playing a part, weren't you? Marietta, you look like a damn nun. He swung a leg over his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He took a step towards the house. That's far enough, Silas said, stepping forward to block his path. The shovel felt heavy and solid in his hands. The lady told you to leave. Cole's eyes finally settled on Silas, sizing him up with a weasel's cunning. This your man, Marietta, a farmer, traded in a whole gang of admirers for one sodbuster. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. I just came for what's owed, a little compensation for my troubles in finding you. Then I'll be on my way. You will get nothing here, Eliza cried out from the porch, her voice rising with hysteria. There is nothing for you. Go back to the pit you crawled out of. Now, that's the Marietta I remember. Cole sneered. All fire and spit. He took another step, and Silas raised the shovel slightly. I won't tell you again, Silas said, his voice a low growl. Get on your horse. Ride out. Don't look back. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a standoff, the only sound the incessant whining of the wind. Cole looked from the shovel in Silas's hands to the grim set of his jaw, and a flicker of caution entered his shifty eyes. He was a scavenger, not a fighter. He gave a final, venomous look towards Eliza. This ain't over, he hissed. There's others looking for you. They won't be as polite as me. He backed away, swung himself onto his tired horse, and without another word, he wheeled the animal around and rode back the way he had come, a hunched, resentful figure shrinking back into the vastness of the plains. Silas stood watching until he was gone, his knuckles white on the shovel handle. The air, which had been humming with tension, was now utterly still. The silence that descended was the silence of a tomb. He finally turned, his movements slow and stiff, and looked at his wife. She was leaning against a porch post, her face buried in her hands, her body trembling uncontrollably. He walked to the porch and stood before her, waiting. The questions were a raging torrent in his mind, a flood of doubt and a cold, creeping anger. Marietta, you poured a mean whiskey. Others looking for you. Slowly, she lowered her hands. Her face was ravaged, her careful composure completely gone, leaving behind a terrified stranger. Silas, she whispered, her voice breaking. Who is Marietta? He asked. The question was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the cold, hard question of a judge. They went inside. The oppressive heat of the main room felt like the inside of a furnace. She sank into a chair at the table, while he remained standing, a looming figure of accusation. The brewing storm outside finally broke. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, and the sky darkened. The first drops of rain began to spatter against the window pane. You owe me the truth, he said, all of it. She took a long, shuddering breath, her eyes closed. When she opened them, the terror was still there, but it was joined by a profound, soul-deep weariness, the look of a person who has been running for a very, very long time and has finally reached the end of the road. My name, she began, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it over the rising storm. was Marietta Stone." She told him everything. The words came out in a halting, painful rush, as if she were pulling them from a deep, infected wound. She wasn't an orphan from Ohio. She had been born in a mining camp in the mountains, her mother a woman of ill repute, her father a name she never knew. She had been passed from one uncle to another until she was 15, when she'd been sold to a man who ran a saloon on the outlaw trail, a wretched, violent place called the Gilded Cage. "I wasn't a woman of the night," she said, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes fixed on them as if the shame was too great to look at him. "Not in the way you're thinking, but I was their property. I was the entertainment." She described a life that was a nightmare to Silas's simple, God-fearing mind. A life of drunken, violent men, of fear as a constant companion. She poured their whiskey, sang their bawdy songs, and endured their rough hands and rougher words. She smiled when she wanted to scream and laughed when she wanted to die. The scars on her back were from the night the saloon owner, a man named Finch, had pressed a hot branding iron against her for spilling a bottle of expensive liquor. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the gang of outlaws who frequented the saloon, led by Finch, were her keepers. Cole Hackett had been one of them, a bottom feeder who hung on the fringes. "I lived like that for 3 years, she whispered, the rain now lashing against the house. "Every day, I prayed for a way out, an escape, or death. I wasn't sure which I wanted more." Her chance came one night when a drunken card game turned into a gunfight. In the chaos, she slipped out the back, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bag of coins she had managed to hide. She ran. She ran for days, sleeping in ditches, stealing food, until she collapsed from exhaustion in a town hundreds of miles away. She was found by a minister's wife, a kind, elderly woman who took her in without asking questions. For 6 months, she lived at the back of the church, helping the woman with chores, slowly learning to feel safe again. It was there, in the quiet solitude of the church library, that she hatched her plan. She saw the advertisements in the newspapers. Men in the West, lonely men looking for wives. "I knew no decent man would have me if he knew the truth," she said. And for the first time, she looked up at him, her gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I knew I was tainted, unclean, so I created someone else. I created Eliza Mayhew." She practiced her handwriting, copying passages from the Bible until her script was elegant and refined. She studied the mannerisms of the minister's wife, learning to speak softly, to cast her eyes down, to be the very picture of piety and modest virtue. She invented a past, a life in a Methodist orphanage, a life of innocence. She used the church's address to send and receive the letters. "I wanted a new life, Silas," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I wanted a chance to be clean. I saw your letter. You sounded honest, decent, a man of the earth. I thought with you, I could be safe. I thought I could finally leave Marietta behind in that saloon and just be Eliza." Silas listened, his face a mask of stone. The storm raged outside, and an even greater one raged within him. Every word she spoke was a blow. Every confession was another layer of the lie he had been living. The quiet, shy woman he had felt a reluctant tenderness for, the fragile creature he had wanted to protect, did not exist. She was a phantom, a fiction. In her place was Marietta Stone, a saloon girl with a past so dark it stained the very air in his house. The anger came then, cold and hard and pure. It wasn't just anger at her past, it was a white-hot fury at the deception. He felt like the world's biggest fool. He had opened his home, his life, the memory of his sainted Sarah, to a lie. She had played him, used his loneliness and his decency as her escape route. "You lied to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "From the very first letter, every word." "I had to," she cried, finally breaking down into sobs. "What choice did I have? You always have a choice, he bit back, his voice rising. You could have chosen to be honest. You chose to be a liar. You stood on that train platform in a white dress, looking me in the eye. And you lied. The white dress, the symbol of purity, now seemed like the cruelest mockery of all. I was desperate, she wept. And what am I? He roared, slamming his fist on the table, making her jump. Am I just a fool to be used? A place to hide? Is that all I am to you? He looked at her, at the beautiful, tear-stained face of the stranger who was his wife, and all he felt was a cold, bitter rage. The tentative connection they had built, the fragile intimacy of that one sad kiss, was gone, burned to ash by the fire of her confession. Get out, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and horror. What? Get out of my room, he clarified, his gaze like flint. That room was my wife's. It was Sarah's. You will not sleep in there again. You can have the cot, or the floor, I don't care, but you will not profane that room with any more of your lies. He turned his back on her then, unable to look at her any longer, and strode to the bedroom door. He went inside and slammed it shut, the sound as final as a gunshot. He spent the night in the bed, his bed, but he did not sleep. He lay there, listening to the storm and the sound of her quiet, broken weeping from the other room. His anger was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He felt betrayed, disgusted, and underneath it all, a deep, hollow ache of loss for the woman he had thought she was. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the storm had begun to recede, he heard the front door of the house creak open and then shut. He lay still for a moment, listening. Silence. A terrible suspicion took hold of him. He got up, threw open the bedroom door. The main room was empty. Her cot was untouched. Her small carpetbag was gone. Fool, he cursed himself. Damned fool. He knew what she had done. She had run again, back into the wilderness that had almost swallowed her once before. He pulled on his boots and coat and burst out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the wind was still howling, and it was picking up the loose sand. A prelude to a full-blown sandstorm. The night was pitch black, the moon and stars obliterated by a ceiling of roiling clouds. Eliza! He bellowed into the wind, the name torn from his lips. He didn't know why he used it. Marietta was the truth. Eliza was the lie, but it was Eliza he called for. Marietta! There was no answer but the shriek of the wind. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his anger. He could not let her die out here. Whatever she was, whatever she had done, he could not let the desert take her. He ran to the barn, saddled Marengo with frantic, fumbling hands, and rode out into the swirling darkness. The world dissolved into a blinding, stinging chaos of sand and wind. He could barely see a few feet in front of him. He rode blindly, shouting her name until his throat was raw, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own. He searched for what felt like hours, a desperate, hopeless quest in a world that had lost all its landmarks. He found her by sheer, dumb luck. The horse shied at a dark shape huddled at the base of a rock outcropping. It was her. She was on her knees, her head bowed, her small bag beside her. She was not moving. He leaped from the saddle and rushed to her side. He grabbed her shoulder and turned her over. Her face was pale, caked with sand. Her lips cracked, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and delirious. She was exhausted, beaten by the storm and her own despair. Silas, she breathed, a whisper of a sound. He didn't say a word. His anger was gone, replaced by a grim, bone-weary sense of responsibility. He lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, like a bundle of sticks. He carried her to the horse, managed to get her settled in front of him in the saddle, and turned back towards the ranch, the wind tearing at their backs. He got her inside, into the warm, lamp-lit room. He laid her on his own cot, the one she had been meant to sleep on. He washed the sand from her face with a damp cloth. His movements gentle but impersonal. He brought her a cup of water and held it to her lips while she drank. She watched him the entire time, her gray eyes wide and full of a silent, defeated misery. He tended to her needs with the detached efficiency of a doctor. He made sure she was warm, that she had water, but he did not speak to her, and when she was settled, he took a blanket and went to sleep on the hard floor by the cold hearth. As far away from her as he could get, he had saved her from the storm, but a new one, colder and more desolate than any desert wind, had settled between them in the quiet of the house. The sandstorm passed, but it left the world scoured and raw. It also left a drought in its wake, as if it had scoured the very memory of moisture from the sky. The sun, which had once been a source of life, became a malevolent brass eye in a cloudless, bleached white sky. Day after day it baked the land, cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst. The creek that cut through Silas's property shrank from a gurgle to a trickle, and then to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The grass in the pastures turned from green to gold, then to a brittle, lifeless brown. The cattle grew thin, their hides stretched taut over their ribs, their lowing a constant, miserable complaint. Inside the house, a different kind of drought persisted. Silas had saved her life, but he had not offered her forgiveness. A cold, silent truce existed between them. He was no longer openly hostile, his rage having burned itself out into a pile of cold ash. But the warmth was gone. They were two people sharing a space, a routine, but nothing more. He slept on the hard floor, a self-imposed penance and a physical manifestation of the chasm between them. He watched her, no longer with suspicion, but with a profound and weary confusion. He saw the haunted look in her eyes that never left, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. He was living with the ghost of a woman named Marietta, and he did not know what to do. Eliza, for her part, retreated so far into herself she was barely there at all. She worked, she ate, she breathed, but her spirit seemed to have fled. The desperate hope that had carried her across the country to his doorstep was gone, replaced by a quiet, fatalistic despair. She had been found out. Her fragile new life, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled. She was merely waiting for the final blow to fall. The final blow began to fall on the day old man Abernathy gave up. His ranch bordered Silas's to the east, and he was a man who had been etched from the same hard rock as the land itself. But the drought broke him. Silas saw the wagon, loaded with the sad, meager possessions of a lifetime, trundling past his property line. He rode out to meet it. Abernathy's face was a roadmap of defeat. "Can't do it no more, Silas," the old man said, his voice a dry rasp. "Lost half my herd. Well's gone dry. The land's beaten me." He told Silas he'd sold the deed for a pittance to a land speculator in town, who'd already found a new buyer. Some outfit moving in. Got money. They say, don't know 'em. A few days later, the new outfit arrived. Silas watched them from a rise, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. There were 5 of them, hard-looking men with a restless, predatory energy that didn't belong on a cattle ranch. They weren't homesteaders. They rode with the slouch of men who were more comfortable with a gun in their hand than a shovel. Their leader was a tall, rangy man with a long, dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat that shadowed a face Silas couldn't quite make out. Their presence felt like a sickness on the land, a blight. He did not realize Eliza was standing behind him until she made a small, strangled sound. He turned. She was staring at the distant figures, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face a mask of pure, blood-drained terror. It was a terror that went beyond fear of strangers. It was the terror of recognition. "What is it?" he demanded. "Who are they?" She shook her head, unable to speak, and fled back to the house. That evening, She approached him as he sat on the porch, staring out at the new, unwelcome lights flickering from the Abernathy place.
"We have to leave, Silas,"
she said, her voice a low, urgent tremor.
"Leave? Don't be a fool. This is my home."
"The drought will kill the rest of the cattle anyway," she insisted, her eyes wild with a desperation he hadn't seen since the night of the storm. "Sell them. Sell what's left for whatever you can get. We can take the money and go north, Oregon. Maybe start again." "Run. I don't run," he said flatly, his jaw tight with the stubborn pride of a man who had only ever known how to stand his ground.
"Please,"
she begged, and for the first time since her confession, she reached out and touched him, her fingers closing over his arm in a frantic, desperate grip. "I am begging you, there is a great evil in that place. If we stay, it will destroy us." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her terrified face. His own anger, his own sense of betrayal, seemed a petty thing in the face of the stark, primal fear he saw in her. He knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that her fear was connected to the men on the Abernathy ranch, the others that Cole Hackett had warned of. Finch, the man who had branded her. He looked from her pleading face to the dark silhouette of the neighboring ranch house. Every instinct he had was to fight, to protect his land, his home. But as he looked back at her, at the trembling woman who was his wife in name but a stranger in truth, he realized his land and his cattle were no longer the most valuable things he stood to lose. The thought of her being hurt, of that terror in her eyes being realized, was a prospect more terrifying than drought or ruin. He covered her hand with his own. "I'm not afraid of them," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't acknowledged until this very moment. He looked directly into her eyes, forcing her to see the truth of his words. "I'm afraid of losing you." The words hung in the air between them, a confession more profound than any kiss. It was an admission that, despite the lies, despite the cold distance, she mattered. Marietta, Eliza, whoever she was, she mattered. Her face crumpled. The terror in her eyes was suddenly swamped by a wave of disbelief, of shock, of a fragile, impossible hope. She stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue, as if love was a language she had long forgotten. And then, something inside her broke. She pulled her hand from his and stumbled back into the house. He followed, finding her standing in the middle of the room, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. "You don't know," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "You don't know what you're saying. You can't be afraid of losing me. You don't even know what I am." And then she did the most shocking thing he had ever seen. With frantic, clumsy fingers, she began to unbutton the front of her simple work dress. It wasn't the white wedding gown, but it was a uniform of her penance, of the quiet, dutiful role she had been playing. "What are you doing?" he asked, taking a step towards her. "I'm showing you," she choked out, her voice thick with tears and hysteria. "I'm showing you what you're offering to protect." She shrugged the dress from her shoulders, letting it pool around her ankles. She stood before him in her thin cotton chemise, a pale, vulnerable figure in the flickering lamplight. Then she turned, showing him her back. The scars, the faint, silvery lines he had seen once before, were now starkly visible, a testament to a pain he could only imagine. But this time, it was different. She reached behind her, and her hand found his. Her skin was cold as ice. She pulled his hand forward, his rough, calloused fingers a dark contrast to her pale skin, and she pressed his palm flat against the scars. "This," she whispered, her voice breaking, "was for a bottle of whiskey. He held me down. Silas, Finch did, the man who is living on that ranch. He laughed while he did it." Silas's blood ran cold. He felt the raised, healed flesh under his palm, and a murderous rage, so pure and so absolute it almost blinded him, rose up in his throat. He wanted to kill the man. He wanted to ride over there and tear him apart with his bare hands. She turned back to face him, her eyes shining with tears. She kept his hand in hers, pulling it from her back and pressing it now against her chest, directly over her heart. He could feel its frantic, terrified thumping against his palm.
He told me I was his property,
she sobbed, the words tumbling out now, the final, ugliest truth she had kept locked away. He said my body was his to use and my soul was his to break. They all watched, they made bets. They treated me like an animal, a plaything, not a person, never a person. She was giving him not just the facts of her past, but the feeling of it, the shame, the terror, the utter dehumanization. She was stripping herself bare, not just of her clothes, but of her last defenses, her last secrets. She was showing him the broken thing at her core, the part of her she was sure would make him turn away in disgust forever.
"Do you see now?"
she cried, her face a mask of anguish.
"There is no Eliza. There is no innocent orphan. There is only Marietta, damaged, tainted. I am the dirt he wiped his boots on, and he is right over there. Silas, he has come to finish the job, to drag me back. That is what you're afraid of losing. That is what you say you will protect."
He looked at her, at this shattered, beautiful, terrifyingly brave woman, and the last of his anger, the last of his resentment, dissolved. He saw not a saloon girl, not a liar, but a survivor, a woman who had walked through hell and had somehow, impossibly, retained a flicker of a soul. He moved his hand from her heart and cupped her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears.
"I see you,"
he said, his voice thick. "Marietta, Eliza, I don't care what your name is. I see you." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like the first time, not a kiss of sadness and confusion. This was a kiss of acceptance, of desperation, of a fierce, protective love that had finally found its voice. It was a promise. She answered him with a broken sob, her arms wrapping around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. He lifted her into his arms, her body as light as a child's, and carried her into the bedroom. He laid her gently on the bed, their bed. He thought, for the first time, the moon was high and full, flooding the room with a pale, ethereal light through the open window, a silent witness in a sky full of stars. What happened next was not an act of passion, but an act of prayer. It was a desperate, frantic coming together of two lonely, broken souls in the face of annihilation. It was fierce and clumsy and drenched in tears, his tears and hers. Every touch was a question and an answer. His hands, which knew only the rough work of the ranch, learned a new language on her skin, a language of reverence and gentleness. He explored the landscape of her body, not just the soft curves, but the scars, tracing them with his fingers, kissing them as if to erase the memory of the fire that had created them. And for Eliza, for Marietta, it was a terrifying surrender. She, who had only ever known the touch of men as a violation, an act of ownership, now felt a touch that was meant to heal. She cried throughout, not from pain or from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of it, the shock of being held with tenderness, the shock of being treated not as an object, but as something precious, the shock of feeling, for the very first time in her life, something that was not lust, or duty, or terror, but something sacred, something that felt like love. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the moonlight washing over them. Her head was on his chest, and he could feel the slow, steady beat of her heart finally calming. "No one will ever hurt you again," he whispered into her hair, the words a solemn vow made to the stars, to the night, to whatever God might be listening. "I swear it." She looked up at him, her gray eyes luminous in the dark, and for the first time, he saw them clear of fear, clear of sorrow, clear of everything but him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They fell asleep like that, Two survivors clinging to a makeshift raft in a hostile sea, having found a moment of grace in the heart of the storm. But the storm had not passed. It had only been gathering its strength. Silas woke first, to the pale, gray light of dawn. A sense of profound peace settled over him, something he hadn't felt in years. He looked down at the woman sleeping in his arms, her face soft and unguarded in the morning light, and his heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. He had a purpose again. He had someone to fight for. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and pulled on his trousers. He went to the window, intending to start the day's chores. A new man. He looked out towards the corral where he kept the bulk of his herd, and his blood froze. It was empty. A frantic, terrible dread seized him. He grabbed his rifle from its rack by the door and ran outside, his bare feet pounding on the cold, hard-packed dirt. The corral gate was open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The tracks were clear in the dust, dozens of cattle, driven hard. Their tracks mingled with the hoofprints of 5 horses, heading east, towards the Abernathy place. He ran to the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs, and then he saw it. Nailed to the big barn door, stark against the weathered wood, was the freshly severed head of a calf, and beneath it, painted in the calf's dark, sticky blood, was a single, crudely written word. Marietta. The peace of the dawn was a lie. It was a thin, fragile veneer stretched over a reality of blood and ruin. The grotesque message on the barn door was more than a threat. It was a declaration of war, a brutal reminder that Marietta's past was not a ghost to be outrun, but a living predator that had tracked her to this last, fragile sanctuary. The ranch began to die. It was a slow, agonizing process that mirrored the decay of hope in their hearts. The stolen herd had been their future, their bulwark against the unforgiving land. Without them, the ranch was just a collection of sun-bleached buildings on a patch of dying earth. The drought, no longer just a hardship, became a death sentence. The last of the muddy pools in the creek bed dried up and cracked like old pottery. The well grew shallower each day. The water they drew tasting of grit and desperation. They rationed their food. The dwindling supplies in the larder a constant, silent countdown to starvation. The love and acceptance they had found in the moonlit bedroom felt like a fever dream, a beautiful memory from a different lifetime. In its place, a new tension grew, born of fear and grim resolve. Silas was a changed man. The quiet, grieving rancher was gone, replaced by a hunter. His sorrow had been burned away by a cold, silent rage that smoldered behind his eyes. He spent his days cleaning his rifle, sharpening his knives, and staring eastward towards the Abernathy place, his face a granite mask. Eliza watched him, her heart a cold, tight knot of guilt. This was her fault. She had brought this plague upon him. She had offered him a lie, and in return, he had given her a moment of grace, a vow of protection. Now, that vow was going to get him killed. The men on that ranch were not simple cattle thieves. They were monsters. She knew their casual cruelty, their bottomless capacity for violence. Finch, their leader, was the devil she had fled from in the night. And Silas, for all his strength and goodness, was just a man. "You cannot go," she told him one evening, her voice taut with a fear that was a physical sickness. He was checking the action on his Winchester, the metallic clicks loud and final in the quiet room. "There's no choice," he said without looking up. "They took what was mine. They threatened what is mine." His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and the meaning was clear. "You." "They are not just men. Silas," she pleaded, moving to stand before him, trying to block his view of the rifle. "They are animals. They will kill you for sport. Let the cattle go. Let the ranch go. We can still leave. We can walk away. We have each other." He set the rifle down and stood up, his height and the sheer force of his anger dwarfing her. But when he spoke, his voice was not angry, but filled with a terrible, quiet pain. I made you a promise. In that bed, I swore to you that no one would ever hurt you again. Do you think that was just words? Do you think my vow means nothing?
Your life means more,
she cried, tears welling in her eyes. No, he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. No, it doesn't. Not if I stand by and let them come for you. A man who won't protect his wife, his home, he's already dead. He's just waiting for the dirt to cover him. There was nothing more to say. She saw the iron resolve in his eyes, an immovable conviction that was as much a part of him as the land he worked. He was going. He left just before the next dawn, a solitary figure on his best horse, Marengo, with a rifle across his saddle and 2 canteens of their precious water. He kissed her before he left, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and finality. Then he rode out, not looking back, a silhouette against the bloody sunrise. Eliza stood on the porch and watched him disappear into the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence he left behind was a living thing, a suffocating presence that filled the house, the barn, the empty corral. It whispered to her of his death, of her failure, of the inescapable past. She was a curse. She brought ruin to everything she touched. She spent the day in a fugue of terror. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of Finch's men returning. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, to wait here, helpless, while Silas rode toward the men who had brutalized her, was a torture worse than any physical pain. The gilded cage had been a prison of wood and violence. This house had become a prison of fear and helplessness. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, something inside her snapped. The terror did not recede, but it was joined by something else. A sliver of ice-cold rage that was a pale reflection of Silas's own. He was out there, fighting for her, for Marietta, for the broken thing she was. He was honoring his vow. And what was she doing? Hiding, praying, waiting to be either a widow or a captive. No, not again. She went to the small, battered carpet bag she had arrived with, the only thing she owned that was truly hers. It held the few meager possessions she had carried from the church, the artifacts of her invented life as Eliza. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was an artifact from her real life, a life she had sworn to leave behind. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. It was a small, pearl-handled Remington Derringer. It had belonged to a gambler who had lost his nerve in a high-stakes game at the Gilded Cage and had left it behind in his haste to flee. She had taken it, cleaned it, and hidden it away. A secret weapon. A final guarantee that the only person who would ever decide the moment of her death would be her. She had sworn an oath to God in that quiet church that she would never touch it again, that the violence of her past was over. Now, in the twilight of this ruined ranch, she broke that oath. The gun felt cold and heavy in her palm. An evil, familiar weight. It smelled of oil and death. She loaded the 2 small cartridges, her movements clumsy but sure. She was no longer just Eliza, the mail-order bride. She was no longer just the victim. She was Marietta Stone, a woman who had survived the pit, and she would not let the best man she had ever known die for her. She saddled the remaining mare, her movements frantic in the growing dark. She filled a single canteen, took a piece of dried beef, and strapped the Derringer to her ankle, hidden beneath the hem of her worn dress. Then she mounted the horse and rode east, a desperate, solitary woman chasing a memory of love into a heart of darkness. The journey was a descent into hell. The desert at night was a disorienting world of deep shadows and strange, whispering sounds. But the day was worse. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down on her, leaching the moisture from her body, cracking her lips, and burning her skin. The landscape was a monotonous, soul-crushing expanse of rock and sand that offered no shelter, No relief. Thirst became a razor's edge in her throat. Her horse, already weakened by the drought, began to falter, its steps growing heavy and uncertain. Eliza's own strength bled away into the shimmering heat. The world began to lose its sharp edges, dissolving into a blurry, wavering nightmare. And in this state of delirium, the memories came. They rose unbidden from the depths of her mind, more real than the burning sand around her. She was back in the gilded cage, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat and despair. She could hear the coarse laughter, feel the greedy hands pawing at her as she pushed through the crowd. She saw Finch's face, his eyes cold and dead as a snake's, watching her from across the room. She felt the searing pain of the branding iron on her back, smelled her own burning flesh, heard his laughter as she screamed. She remembered the nights of terror, the casual cruelty, the crushing weight of hopelessness. She fell. She didn't remember the horse going down, only the brutal, jarring impact with the hard-baked earth. The mare lay on its side, its leg broken, its breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. Eliza lay beside the dying animal, the sun beating down on her, and she gave up. This was it. This was the end she had been running from. The desert would claim her. It was fitting. A clean, empty death. She closed her eyes, ready for the darkness. But instead of Finch's face, she saw Silas's. She saw him in the moonlight, his eyes full of a tenderness she had never known, his hand on her heart. She heard his voice, a rough, steady anchor in the chaos of her memories. "I see you, Marietta, Eliza, I see you, and the vow. No one will ever hurt you again." A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He had seen all of her, the filth and the lies and the scars, and he had not turned away. He had called her precious. He was fighting for her, and she was dying here in the dirt. A fire, hotter than the sun above, ignited in her chest. It was the rage she had felt earlier, now honed to a fine, sharp point. She would not die here. She would not let him die for her. She would crawl if she had to. She got to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She took her canteen, less than half full, and she began to walk. Each step was an agony. Her feet blistered, her head pounded. The memories came and went, but now they were fuel. Every jeer, every blow, every humiliation from her past became a reason to take another step forward. She was walking not just to Silas, but away from them, away from the creature they had tried to make her. His love was a compass, his promise a shield against the ghosts. Late in the afternoon of the second day, when she was on the verge of collapse, her tongue thick and swollen in her mouth, she heard it. Voices, carried on the wind from over the next rise, rough, male voices, and the unmistakable sound of laughter. She dropped to her belly and crawled the last few yards to the top of the rise. She peered through a cluster of sun-scorched sagebrush. Below her, in a small, rocky canyon, was a campfire, and 5 men, her men, Finch's men, and they were not alone. Silas was there. He was tied to a stunted skeletal tree, his hands bound behind him. His face was a bruised and bloody pulp. His shirt was ripped, his chest and back covered in welts. One of the men, a hulking brute she recognized as Finch's right hand, drove a fist into Silas's stomach. Silas grunted in pain but did not cry out. His head hung low, but even from this distance, she could see the defiant hatred in his eyes as he stared at his tormentors. Finch stood a few feet away, sipping from a flask, watching the proceedings with an air of bored amusement. He was exactly as she remembered, tall and lean, with a cruel, thin-lipped mouth and eyes that held a perpetual chill. "He's a tough one, I'll give him that," Finch said, his voice a lazy drawl that sent a shiver of pure ice down Eliza's spine. Found him snooping around the herd, thought he was just some dumb sodbuster looking for his cows. He took another drink. Then he started asking about Marietta. That's when I knew we'd hit the jackpot. Finch walked over to Silas and grabbed a handful of his bloody hair. yanking his head back. "Tell me, farmer," he sneered into Silas's face. "What's she like in the sack? Did you get her to do all the little tricks I taught her? Or does she still pretend to be a lady?" Silas spat a mouthful of blood and saliva into Finch's face. Finch recoiled, wiping his face with the back of his hand. The bored amusement vanished, replaced by a flash of reptilian fury. "You'll regret that," he hissed. He drew a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. "We'll finish with you, nice and slow, and then we'll go get my property back. I think it's time Marietta came home." That was it. That was the moment. The world went silent for Eliza. The wind, the crackle of the fire, the men's voices, it all faded away. There was only Finch, holding the knife, and Silas, bloody and defiant, about to die. Her hand, moving with a will of its own, slid down to her ankle. The derringer felt small and inadequate, a child's toy against these 5 armed men. But it was all she had. She pulled it free. She had never fired a gun in her life. She rested the barrel on the rock in front of her to steady her shaking hands. She lined up the small sight on the center of Finch's back. She thought of his laughter as he burned her. She thought of his cold hands and his dead eyes. She thought of Silas's vow. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a crack of thunder that split the world in two. It was far louder than she had imagined. The gun bucked in her hand. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a dark, round stain appeared on the back of Finch's coat. He stiffened, a look of profound surprise on his face. The knife clattered from his hand. He turned, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, and tried to scan the ridge. His gaze passed right over her without seeing her. Then he pitched forward and lay still in the dust. For a moment, there was a stunned, absolute silence. The other 4 men stared at their fallen leader, then at the ridge, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Before they could react, Eliza, acting on pure, primal instinct, cocked the second barrel, aimed into their general direction, and fired again. The bullet kicked up dust a few feet from one of the men. It was enough. They were thieves and bullies, not soldiers. With their leader dead, their nerve broke. Yelling in panic, they scrambled for their horses. Within 30 seconds, they were gone, galloping away in a cloud of dust, leaving their dead leader and their captive behind. The silence that descended on the canyon was absolute. Eliza lay on the ridge, the empty derringer still in her hand. Shaking so violently she thought her teeth would chatter out of her head. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her. She had killed a man. She had taken a human life. She began to sob, great, ragged, tearing sobs of grief and terror and relief. But Silas was still tied to that tree. The sight of him brought her back. She scrambled down the rocky slope, her legs weak and unsteady. She ran to him, fumbling with the derringer, using its small barrel to saw at the ropes binding his hands. When he was free, he slumped forward, and she caught him. He was heavy, a dead weight of bruised and broken flesh. He was conscious, but barely. His breath came in ragged gasps.
"Eliza,"
he rasped, his voice a mangled whisper. "You came."
"I came,"
she wept, holding him up. He looked past her, at the still form of Finch lying in the dust, and then back at her face, at the gun still clutched in her hand. He saw it all. He understood. He reached up a trembling, bloody hand and touched her face. "My brave girl," he whispered. She helped him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulder, taking most of his weight, and together, 2 broken, bleeding figures, they began the long, silent, painful journey back to their ruined home. The victory was ashes in their mouths. They had survived, but the wilderness, both inside and out, had scarred them forever. The journey back was a silent pilgrimage through a private hell. Silas, barely conscious for much of the ride, was a dead weight that Eliza somehow managed to keep in the saddle. She walked beside the horse, her own body a symphony of pain, her mind a hollow, echoing chamber where the thunder of the derringer's shot played over and over again. They were a tableau of ruin, a battered man, a haunted woman, and a weary horse, inching their way across a landscape that had already pronounced them dead. When they finally saw the silhouette of their small house against the bruised twilight sky, there was no sense of relief. It was not a home they were returning to, but a tombstone marking the grave of a life that had never truly begun. The empty corral, the parched well, the bloodstain on the barn door. It was all evidence of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. For 3 days, Eliza tended to Silas. She cleaned his wounds with the last of the clean water, her touch gentle but her face a mask of grim efficiency. She tore strips from her petticoat for bandages. She fed him broth from their dwindling supplies, spooning it into his mouth as if he were a child. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his sleep troubled by fevered mutterings. In those moments, she was not Marietta the saloon girl or Eliza the liar. She was simply a woman keeping a vigil over the only good thing she had ever known, praying to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Silas woke, his eyes clear for the first time, and looked at her. He saw the exhaustion etched onto her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the raw, blistered skin on her hands. He saw the woman who had walked through the desert and faced down a killer to save him. He reached out a weak hand and took hers. No words were needed. But the world outside their small bubble of pain and healing had not been idle. The surviving members of Finch's gang had not simply vanished. They had ridden hard to redemption, fueled by whiskey and a coward's rage, and had told their own version of the story. A story of a simple land deal gone wrong, of an unprovoked attack by a crazed homesteader and his violent, unhinged wife, a woman. They hinted with leering smiles of a particularly sordid background. The town, already simmering with suspicion about Silas Blackwood's mysterious mail-order bride, was fertile ground for such seeds of slander. When Silas, leaning heavily on Eliza, finally rode into town a week later to see the doctor and buy what meager supplies they could afford, they were met not with sympathy, but with a wall of cold, accusatory stares. Sheriff Brody, a man whose primary concern was maintaining a fragile peace and his own comfortable position, met them in front of the general store. "Blackwood," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "There's been talk, serious talk. A man is dead. Finch, his men say your wife shot him in the back."
"His men are lying cowards,"
Silas rasped, his voice still raw. "Maybe so," the sheriff said, his eyes flicking uneasily to Eliza, who stood silent and pale beside Silas. "But the fact is, a man is dead on land that borders yours, and this woman," he gestured towards Eliza, "is at the center of it. The townsfolk are spooked. They're demanding something be done. There's going to be an informal hearing. Tonight, at the saloon, you'll both be there." It was not a request. It was a command, a mock trial, a public spectacle designed to soothe the town's fears and assign blame. That evening, the saloon was packed. It smelled of stale beer, sweat, and self-righteousness. A makeshift courtroom had been arranged, with Sheriff Brody sitting behind a poker table, looking deeply uncomfortable. Silas and Eliza stood before him, the entire town their jury. The air was thick with judgment. The accusations began. A torrent of poison. Cole Hackett, the weasel who had first found her, had been brought in from some dark corner and was now puffed up with a sense of importance. "I seen her before," he declared, pointing a grimy finger at Eliza. "She was a saloon girl, down on the outlaw trail. Name of Marietta, poured whiskey for the worst kind of filth. She's a charlatan, sheriff, a painted cat who tricked this poor man into marrying her. A woman from the church, a sour-faced gossip named Mrs. Gable, stood up. Her behavior has been an affront to God since the day she arrived, dressed in a wedding gown, the very picture of innocence. But with the eyes of a sinner, she has brought violence and death to our peaceful community." They called her a liar, a temptress, a whore, a murderess. With every word, Eliza flinched as if struck. She stood with her eyes fixed on the floor. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, enduring the verbal stoning with a terrible, silent stillness. She had expected this. This was the world she knew, a world that would always see her for the dirt on her soul, not the goodness she so desperately craved. She was Marietta Stone, and she was guilty. Finally, when the last of the venom had been spat, the sheriff turned his tired eyes to Silas. "Blackwood, you got anything to say in your wife's defense?" Silas, his ribs tightly bandaged, his face still a roadmap of purple and yellow bruises, took a slow, painful step forward. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, the people he had lived alongside for years, and he saw a jury of strangers. He reached out and took Eliza's cold, trembling hand in his own. A simple, public act of ownership and solidarity. "First thing you need to understand," Silas began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room, "is that this trouble isn't hers. It's mine, because she is mine." He let that sink in. Then he began to speak. He told them everything, his voice growing stronger with every word. His simple, unadorned honesty, a stark contrast to the flowery accusations that had come before. "You all know me. You know I'm not a man for many words. You know I lost my wife, Sarah, and you know the loneliness that's lived in my house since. So yes, I sent for a bride, a helpmate. I sent for a woman named Eliza Mayhew." He squeezed her hand. "And the woman who answered was the bravest I have ever known." A murmur went through the crowd. "Her name was Marietta Stone," Silas continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "And yes, she lived in a saloon because she had no choice. She was sold to it as a girl. She was kept there, a prisoner, by a man named Finch. She was his property, to be used and abused as he saw fit. She endured things in that place that would make you thank God for the simple, decent lives you lead, things that left scars on her back and on her soul." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces. "She escaped. She ran for her life and found shelter with a church. And in that church, she created Eliza Mayhew. She created a woman who might have a chance at a life, a chance to be safe, a chance to be loved. Was it a lie? Yes, it was, but you tell me." He challenged them, his voice rising. "Which one of you, if you had walked through the fires of hell, wouldn't lie for a drink of cool water on the other side?" The room was utterly silent. Finch and his animals found her, not because she did anything wrong, but because men like that believe that once they own you forever. They came to my land. They stole my cattle. They left a warning, written in blood, that they were coming back for their property, for my wife. "I went after them," Silas said, his voice dropping, "because that is what a husband does. And they caught me. They tied me to a tree and they beat me. They were going to kill me, slow. And then they were going to come back here, to my home, and they were going to take her. They were going to drag her back to that hell she had crawled out of." He turned then and looked down at Eliza, his face softening with a tenderness and an awe that stunned the onlookers into silence. "But they didn't count on her," he said softly, as if speaking only to her. "They didn't count on her courage. This woman, who had every reason to run and hide, who had sworn off violence forever, she walked across that desert alone. She found me. She saw the man who had brutalized her for years, standing over her husband with a knife, and she did what any one of you would pray you had the strength to do. She protected her family. She saved my life." He turned back to the crowd, his eyes blazing now. "You call her violent. I call her a survivor. You call her a sinner. I call her a miracle. You can whisper and you can judge and you can cast your stones, but I want you all to hear me. This is my wife, and she is the bravest woman I have ever known." He finished, his chest heaving with the effort. He stood there, defiant, holding his wife's hand, a battered king defending his wounded queen in a court of fools. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of minds changing, of certainties being shattered. A few of the ranchers, men who understood the hard laws of survival, looked at Silas with a newfound respect. Some of the women looked at Eliza and saw not a sinner, but a woman who had suffered, and a flicker of sympathy appeared in their eyes. But for most, the story was too sordid, the scandal too deep. Mrs. Gable sniffed, her face a mask of disapproval. This kind of darkness had no place in her clean, orderly world. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, eager to put an end to the affair. "There's no body, no proof of anything other than a man is gone. The rest of Finch's men have cleared out. As far as redemption is concerned, this matter is closed." He looked at Silas and Eliza. "But it might be best, for everyone, if you were to move on. This town, it has a long memory." It was an eviction notice, wrapped in the guise of advice. Silas simply nodded. He already knew. They could not build a life on this poisoned ground. They sold the ranch for a handful of dollars to the same speculator who had bought Abernathy's land. They packed their few belongings into a single wagon. As they rode out of redemption for the last time, no one came to see them off. They were pariahs, ghosts leaving a town that had already forgotten them. They traveled north, into the higher country. The landscape changed. The harsh red desert gave way to rolling hills covered in tall, golden grass. The air grew cooler, cleaner. They found a small, unclaimed valley nestled between aspen groves, with a clear, fast-running creek cutting through it. This was it. This was their place. They worked side by side, building their new home. They felled the trees, hewed the logs, and raised the walls of a small, sturdy cabin. The labor was hard, but it was a clean, honest kind of work. It was the work of creation, not of survival. With every swing of the axe, with every nail hammered home, they were not just building a house, they were building a new life, a new foundation. This time, there were no lies between them. The wood was true, the cornerstones were square, and so were they. One evening, as the last of the work was done, they stood outside their new home, watching the sun set. The sinking light set the hills on fire, a blaze of gold and orange. It was a beautiful, peaceful fire, not the destructive kind that had haunted their pasts. Eliza went into the cabin and emerged a few moments later. She was wearing her old white cotton wedding dress, but it was different. She had taken her shears to it. The hem, once modestly sweeping the ground, was now cut short, falling just below her knees. The alteration was practical, sensible, for a life of work, not of pretense, but it was also a statement. It revealed her strong, capable legs, legs that had carried her through the desert, and it no longer hid the faint, silvery scars on her skin should a breeze press the fabric against her. They were a part of her, no longer a source of shame to be concealed, but a testament to what she had survived. She came and stood beside him. Silas looked at her, at the woman in the transformed white dress, her face calm and her eyes clear in the golden light, and his heart was so full he thought it might break. She looked up at him. They exchanged a long, deep look, a universe of understanding passing between them in the quiet twilight. They were no longer the lonely rancher and the frightened mail-order bride playing their desperate roles. They were Silas and Eliza, two broken souls who had survived the wasteland, who had walked through the fire and found not destruction, but a love that had been forged in it, as strong and true as the mountains that stood guard around their new home. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts on Silas and Eliza's journey, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier.